When you're in the market for a new audio interface, most producers waste precious money on flashy features they'll never use, and the spec sheets look like gibberish if you don't know what you're looking for. So by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to look for, things like inputs, preamps, monitoring, expandability, as well as what not to waste your money on. My name is Caleb, I'm a session musician and producer, and I've also had the pleasure of trying out tons of audio interfaces over the years so that you don't have to. But let's start by talking about one of the most in-your-face features, and that is the number of inputs. And this is going to drastically narrow down your options right away. Firstly, a 2-input interface like the Scarlett 2i2 all the way up to the Apollo Twin X is going to be great for a lot of bedroom producers. You can record a stereo acoustic, a stereo keyboard, a vocal and guitar, a kick and a snare. There's a lot of versatility in a compact device like this. Then you get to 4 inputs like the Antelope Audio Zen Quadro or the Apollo X4, which is my current interface, which are generally good for a couple of reasons. Yes, you obviously have a higher number of sources you can record at the same time, such as a minimal drum kit, stereo keyboard and 2 mics, a small horn section if you're feeling crazy. But even for people who don't need all of that at once, you do get a bit more freedom to leave certain sources plugged in and ready to go exactly when you need them. This is big for me because I have multiple instruments in the studio that I need to be accessible at any given moment, as I tend to have very limited time in here, as I'm sure you can relate to some degree. Which brings me to 8 inputs and up. And I say and up because at this point, whether it's 8, 12, 16, or 32, maybe even 48, you ought to realistically know how many inputs you need. 8 is the most common for these standard desk-mounted audio interfaces, and essentially take what I said about 4 inputs and multiply it by 2, 3, or 12. I imagine if you're watching this video, you won't need more than 8, which would allow you to have a nice drum recording setup, maybe record a small band in real time, and or be able to have tons of things plugged in and ready to go once you hit record. But what I really want to emphasize here is that you may not actually need as many inputs as you think, especially because there are some other ways to expand your interface, which we will get into shortly. And more inputs are great if you need them, but I would argue it's better to spend that money on better quality preamps than extra inputs you probably don't need. So let's talk about what that actually means. A mic preamp is essentially taking the signal of your microphone and boosting it to a usable level. And where you start to see differences in preamp quality, it often comes down to how much gain they have and how clean they are. A lot of times you'll see this thing called EIN, and all that really means practically is how quiet the preamp's self-noise is. You know, the electrical hiss you hear sometimes. Obviously, the lower the better, so you'd rather have an EIN of minus 130 dBU than minus 125 dBU. Then you'll see gain range, which tells you exactly how far you can boost the incoming signal. Then you'll see dynamic range, and that just tells you the span between the quietest noise it can capture and the loudest it can handle without distorting. But when it comes to preamps, I'll be honest with you, I've been really impressed by modern interfaces, even budget ones. So if you're buying anything made in the past few years, I don't think you'll run into any major problems, but it's still important to not only compare these specs side by side to make sure you're actually getting what you want, but also listen to them through demos online, as some may have slightly different characteristics. And relating to that topic, you'll sometimes see a button on these interfaces that emulates a vintage preamp like a SSL 4K or the Focusrite Air button. I wouldn't buy an interface specifically for that feature, as it's nothing you can't achieve with free plugins, just so you know. Also, as I said at the beginning of this video, I'm a session musician who plays keys, guitar, and drums, so if you've been thinking about working with a real musician on your songs, click the link in the description to learn more about how I can help you add depth and soul to your next track. But now that you have an understanding of what to look for regarding preamps, let's talk about the best way to actually monitor the signal coming into them. Direct monitoring is a highly marketed feature on many interfaces, even very cheap ones like the Behringer UMC interfaces, but I don't typically use them for recording specifically. Essentially, when you're recording, you of course need to be able to somehow hear what you're recording to make sure everything is sounding and behaving the way it's supposed to. You're either gonna do this via direct monitoring or software monitoring. Software monitoring is a feature inside of your DAW where you can hear the incoming signal through your headphones or speakers. The only potential problem here is that if your computer doesn't have enough processing power to run the number of tracks and plugins in your session, you could experience latency when recording, and that would be very bad. Direct monitoring, on the other hand, is a feature of the audio interface itself and allows you to directly monitor the signal straight from your interface without having to go through the computer first. And this sounds great in theory, but it really depends on your setup. For example, smaller interfaces tend to have a simple direct monitoring on and off button, or even a blend knob to mix your direct signal and your DAW playback signal. Other interfaces have a full companion software where you can independently mix your direct monitor signal or use certain inputs direct and others via software. But here's the thing about direct monitoring. I have an M1 MacBook Air from about 6 years ago, and I have never ever had a problem tracking instruments or vocals with software monitoring because, especially if you know how to reduce latency and prevent unnecessary processing in your sessions, a lot of these machines can handle high track counts really well. And for me, using direct monitoring is just another thing I have to adjust and switch on or off depending on what I'm recording, compared to leaving software monitoring on inside of my DAW and not having to ever think about it. But where I do find direct monitoring useful is when I want to hear my eardrums or my keyboard through my monitors without opening my DAW. In that situation, I find it useful, especially when you can mix via the companion software. All of that to say, if you're truly working with a sketchy computer and are concerned about latency, then direct monitor may be a more important feature for you than it has been for me. If that's the case, I'd try to find something with companion software that will allow you to dial in your own mix, as well as adjust other settings in the interface. I think it's totally worth it. Great feature. But then of course, it begs the question, how am I going to actually monitor with each interface? Any decent interface should give you at least 2 line outputs for your speakers and 1 headphone output with a separate volume control. If you're only recording yourself in the studio, 1 headphone output is perfect and 2 line outputs are great. However, you can get an interface with more line outputs if you want to add a sub or an alternate set of speakers to toggle between for checking your mixes. More on that in a minute. But because this is a complete guide to audio interfaces, I'll also mention here that the additional outputs could be used for running several monitor mixes to musicians in bigger studio setups, or using outboard hardware for processing, or running something like an Atmos setup that requires multiple speakers around the room, but that probably won't apply to most of the people watching this video. I would suggest getting something with 4 or more line outputs if you're even remotely interested in using outboard gear, reamping, having extra monitors, that sort of thing. Because once you settle on an audio interface, this is pretty much what you're stuck with, unless you expand. Expandability is huge for me because it means I'm not locked into the ins and outs of the interface alone, but I can connect it digitally to other gear and have more ins and outs available without having to do any sketchy rigging to achieve it. Now, there are 2 main features you'll see regarding this, with 1 main difference. SpeedIF gives you 2 ins and 2 outs, and ADAT gives you 8 ins and 8 outs. Here's what that looks like practically. My Apollo X4 has 4 inputs and 6 outputs as is. However, I can connect 1 ADAT cable to this Behringer ADA 8200 and it adds 8 inputs. I can then take another cable to do the same thing, which will give me 8 more outputs. So because of this sub $200 piece of gear, I now have taken my interface from a 4-in 6-out interface to a 12-in 14-out interface. And if I needed to take the Apollo on the road for whatever reason, I could easily do so without having to take the whole system with the Behringer unit and everything. And this is honestly an overlooked feature because there are some relatively inexpensive interfaces that have at least an ADAT input, meaning you could use it as is until you're ready to grow with it and expand once you need to. Now, the main connectivity feature I haven't mentioned yet is MIDI, and it may be self-explanatory, but let's hit it. Pretty much all modern MIDI devices like keyboards or control surfaces have USB MIDI built in. So the only reason you would really need standard MIDI ports on your audio interface is if you A, want or need to save USB ports on your computer, or B, you're using older gear that has standard MIDI ports, but not USB MIDI. I personally just use a USB hub so I don't have to worry about it, but it may be convenient, likely not crucial for most producers. Now, this one might be a bit trivial, but let's talk DSP. Some interfaces, most notably, but not exclusively, the Universal Audio Apollo series, allow you to use plugins and effects powered by the interface itself rather than taking up some of your computer's resources. And this is great. I do take advantage of this with my Apollo X4, and the idea is that you don't have to worry about latency, and you can either print effects on the way into your DAW, use them for monitoring, or run them as regular plugins, but without your computer having to handle the weight of it. However, as I talked about before, technology has come a long way, and features like this are, in my opinion, no longer a necessity as much as they are just convenient. And again, I love my Apollo, I love the workflow it allows me, especially as a digital guy, but don't be fooled into thinking that you have to have this feature because really, it's just nice to have. And now, this is a feature in some of the nicer interfaces that I didn't see the value in for a long time, but now I really love it and never want to go without it again, and that is monitor controls. I think about my Apollo X4, obviously, but also the Audient ID series and some of SSL's interfaces. A lot of interfaces have this, but essentially you'll typically get like a dim button, a mute button, a mono button, so you can quickly check your mix in mono without having to like load up a plugin or something like that. And earlier I talked about having alternate speakers to check your mix. A lot of these have an alt button, so you could just click a button and it'll switch really easy without you having to like unplug and plug things back in. Pretty cool. But it's important with any of these features and specs to be realistic with your setup, your goals, and don't overspend on stuff that seems better just because it's bigger or more. But even now that you know all of the important things to look for in an audio interface, it can still be difficult to know which interface to choose. So I actually put together a playlist of some of my audio interface reviews and comparisons so that you can get a bit more clarity before buying. So click here to watch that next. And as always, thanks for hanging out, and I hope you have a wonderful day.